In the last episode, I talked to you about the different ways in which modeling can go wrong. I listed the first three. We're going to deal with the next three in this episode. But just to remind you, the first three things that can go wrong is number one, faulty assumptions. Number two, faulty data and or a faulty model. And number three, fundamental unpredictability. So now the fourth way in which models can go wrong is human irrationality. Yeah, that's you and me. There was a guy named Amos Tversky, again, no longer alive. He was a mathematical psychologist at Stanford, and he tried to model human decision making rationally using mathematics. And so, he would see people going to like a supermarket, and what brand of let's see, what brand of soap should I buy? And so he tried to come up with a model, try to model human decision making where he could predict what kind of soap you would buy if given a certain choice. Well, guess what? His conclusion was people do not make decisions rationally. You can't model it. You can't simulate it with a rational model. So there's an example. Well, actually, back in 1985, Coca-Cola found this out the hard way. They came out with a new Coke. Remember that in '85? Because their brand was failing, and they were worried that I think it was by 1990 they were worried that Pepsi was going to overtake them, so they retooled their recipe, and all their models showed that this had better taste and more sugar. All the models they modeled people's tastes, people's reaction to the new Coke, and the model said, "Go for it." Ended up being a gigantic dud. Why? Because they didn't take into account that humans do not make decisions rationally. Um, I could do a whole episode on that. Okay, fifth way in which models can go wrong is unexpected developments, things you just can't predict. I mean, it's like, could a fish ever predict the invention of fire? It's just not part of their world. And so you can have a great model that models the past, right? And then forecasts the future. But you can never model for that outlying unexpected event, some guy in his garage inventing the computer. You just can't model for that. And one of the great examples of that is back in the late 1700s, a guy named Thomas Malthus. He was a British economist. He published a treatise where he modeled the rate at which the population was growing, and then he modeled the rate at which food was being produced. And lo and behold, he said, "Oh my gosh, we've got a problem here, Houston, because the population is an exponential curve." Remember that? I taught you that in the last episode. And food production is following a linear curve. I also talked to you about that in the last episode. And look what happens. At some point, the population is going to exceed the rate of food production. And that was the crisis. He said, we gotta somehow clip the population back. But this is an example of a really bad model and how it can cause people to react recklessly, thoughtlessly in a way that we regret. This is a perfect example of what I'm talking about. Because what happened is the British government took his model very seriously, said, "Oh my gosh, we've got to avoid this crisis, right? This crisis is just up ahead." And they passed laws against poor people, that passed laws against helping poor people. It got really bad. And then, years later, it evolved into eugenics, where poor people and people who were quote unquote mentally deficient were sterilized so that they wouldn't contribute to the growth of the population. It was all trying to stem the growth of that exponential curve that Malthus said was leading us to a crisis in the near future. People went bananas, crazy. So that's another example of a really bad model, and that's why you have to be careful with models. You have to, because at that time, all the scientists, everybody said, "Oh, he's right, he's right, he's right." There was a consensus. The government even got in on it. They said, "Oh, he's right." And it was a very sad era. Look it up, Google it. There's a very sad era in our history. Anyway, the sixth and final way in which a model can go wrong is what I call lots of moving parts. It's just a situation that is so complicated. There's just a lot of variables, a lot of moving, a lot of interactions, a lot of feedback loops, positive, negative ones, and that's the pandemic we're dealing with right now. It's got a lot of moving parts. More than 200 nations, depending on who you ask. Some people are saying it's more than 180. Some people are saying more than 200. Anyway, it's a whole lot of nations are involved. Each one with their own government, with their own culture, with their own population, with their own health system. Billions of people are now involved. Talk about lots of moving parts. This is a situation that's got a lot of moving parts. Try to model that, baby. Try to model that. Try to simulate that. Try to make a make-believe world that is realistic to what is going on. It's difficult. It's very, very difficult. And that's why a lot of the early pandemic models are backtracking big time. Big time. And I knew it all along. I don't want to come across like some no, but I told my wife, I said, these models are over the top. They're over the top. Can't believe them. I mean, I'm not saying let's not do anything, but let's not go crazy. Let's not panic, overreact, and create an even worse problem, which is the problem with when you believe a bad model, even if it's a bad model where there is consensus. Anyway, so I'm going to end with a little clip that I saw Dr. Fauci, who's, by the way, I've interviewed Dr. Fauci years ago when I was doing a Nightline segment on HIV. But Dr. Fauci, I saw him say something the other day that just fit perfectly with what I'm trying to explain to you. He's a scientist, I'm a scientist. So have a listen, and then I'll have a closing word.
There are things called models. And when someone creates a model, they put in various assumptions. And the model is only as good and as accurate as your assumptions. And whenever the modelers come in, they give a worst case scenario and a best case scenario. Generally, the reality is somewhere in the middle. I've never seen a model of the diseases that I've dealt with, which the worst case scenario actually came out. They always overshoot.
Okay, so here's the bottom line. And this is how I want to end. You're the one who's going to help determine the future of this pandemic by the decisions you're making right this very minute. Are you self-quarantining? Are you washing your hands? Are you keeping your distance from others if you have to go out or not? You see, you, not the curve fitters, not the make-believe model makers, not all the supercomputer oracles of Delphi in the world, you, my friend, have the power to help shape the curve, to help determine the outcome of this crisis. You. I want to leave you with that thought. All right, stay safe, stay strong, and above all, no matter what, stay positive.